Seoul drowned that night. Rain fell like the sky itself had given up trying to hold anything together, and somewhere beneath it, a black SUV tore through the flooded streets with its horns screaming and its tires fighting for grip. Inside, 4 armed men shouted over each other in Korean, their hands pressed uselessly against a chest that wouldn't stop bleeding. In the back seat, Kum Tussa, the man half of Seoul feared and the other half prayed to, was dying. 3 gunshot wounds. A heartbeat that kept slipping and catching, until it didn't catch at all. They broke through the gates of the private trauma center with the horns still blaring. The doors of the ER cracked open under the weight of men who didn't know how to knock. Blood hit the floor before the gurney did. A voice, thick with fear and fury, cut through the chaos. "Help him! He's dying!" Nobody needed the translation. Victoria Troy had worked nights in that hospital long enough to think she'd seen everything violence could do to a body. She hadn't seen this. 3 entry wounds clustered so close to the heart that survival should have already been off the table. She found his pulse anyway, thin, stuttering, refusing to quit just yet, and she ran the gurney into surgery with her hands still pressed against his chest. The operating room fought for him for what felt like forever. Compressions, transfusions, a team of surgeons burning through every trick they had. His heart stopped twice, and twice they clawed it back. The 3rd time, it didn't come back. The monitor's scream flattened into one long, hollow tone, and the surgeons stepped back from the table the way people step back from something that's already over. "Time of death," the lead surgeon said, already pulling off his gloves. Victoria didn't step back. She climbed onto the gurney instead, straddling a man she'd known for less than an hour, and drove both palms into his chest. Someone shouted for her to stop. She didn't stop. Sweat and tears fell onto tattooed skin gone the color of ash, and she counted compressions out loud like a prayer, because at that point it was 1. 9 minutes past flatline, 9 minutes past the point where every textbook, every protocol, every rational voice in that room said it was finished. His monitor screamed back to life. His eyes opened. Steel gray locked onto her face like he'd been waiting for it. 9 minutes of cardiac arrest was nothing compared to the war ahead. If you're watching this and your heart's already pounding right along with that monitor, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're tuning in from tonight. And if you're the kind of person who believes a nurse should never have to pay for doing her job right, hit like and subscribe, because Victoria Troy is about to find out exactly what she signed up for. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know what he was. All she knew, standing in an operating room gone silent except for the steady, stubborn beep of a heart that shouldn't be beating, was that something had shifted the moment his eyes found hers, and it wasn't going to unshuft, no matter how badly she wanted her old life back. In the underworld, an act of mercy is the most dangerous crime of all. By morning, the black cars were already outside her building. Morning didn't come gently. It came with 2 black SUVs parked outside Victoria's apartment building, engines idling in the gray Seoul light, and 4 men in dark suits standing beside them like they had nowhere better to be and all the patience in the world to wait for her. She saw them from her 3rd-floor window, still in yesterday's scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and someone else's blood. Her hands hadn't stopped shaking since 50 a.m. She told herself it was the adrenaline crash. She told herself a lot of things that morning that weren't quite true. Victoria Troy had buried her exhaustion in routine for 3 years: coffee, 12-hour shifts, more coffee, sleep that never lasted long enough. Routine was the only thing that had kept her steady since she'd left home. It was the only thing that made a foreign city feel survivable. And now routine had cracked open at 7 a.m. the night before, and she didn't know yet how to put it back together. She thought about the hands that had grabbed the gurney rail beside her, about the man's voice, thick with an accent and terror, saying help him, he's dying, like the words themselves might keep it from being true. She thought about steel-gray eyes opening for one impossible second in the middle of chaos, finding hers like he already knew her, and then closing again like a door. She had felt his heart stop under her palms. She had felt it start again 9 minutes later, against everything she'd been taught, against every rule that said the human body doesn't get a 9th life. And now there were men outside her building who looked like they'd stepped straight out of whatever world he came from, and Victoria understood, standing at that window with her coffee going cold in her hand, that the flatline hadn't been the end of anything. It had been the beginning. She almost didn't go down. She stood in her kitchen for 11 minutes, she counted, because counting felt like control, telling herself she could call in sick, could stay locked inside with the chain on the door, could pretend she was just another nurse who'd done her job and nothing more. But Victoria Troy had never in her life been the kind of woman who hid from a problem. Her mother hadn't raised her that way, working 3 jobs back home just to keep the lights on, teaching her daughter that you face what's in front of you, you don't run from it. So she went down. The man closest to the door didn't reach for a weapon. He bowed, an actual bow, low and formal, the kind she'd only seen in films, and when he straightened, his face was something close to reverent. "Nurse Troy," he said, in careful, deliberate English. "Mr. Cum asks that you not be troubled by our presence. We are here only to protect you." "Protect me from what?" Victoria asked, though some part of her already knew the shape of the answer, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. The man's jaw tightened. "From what happens to people who save men like him?" She didn't get a clearer answer than that. Not that morning. He held the car door open, and when she refused it, flatly, arms crossed, refusing to be moved by 4 strangers and their expensive silence, he didn't argue. He simply told her quietly that a car would remain outside her building whether she wanted it there or not, and that if she saw anyone unfamiliar near her home, she should not hesitate to run. Run from what? She wanted to ask again. But something about the stillness in his eyes told her that if she pushed harder, she might get an answer she wasn't ready to carry to work that day. She went to the hospital anyway. 12-hour shift, same as always, except nothing about that day was the same as always. Word had already spread through trauma center staff by the time she clocked in, not officially, never officially, but in the way rumors move through hospital hallways faster than any memo. "Did you hear who Nurse Troy brought back last night? Did you hear what happened in room 4? Nobody said his name out loud. A few of the older nurses wouldn't even look directly at her, like proximity to the miracle made her dangerous, too. Dr. Yun found her in the break room around noon, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "You know who that was," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know he was dying and I wasn't going to let him," Victoria said. "That's all I need to know." Dr. Yun studied her for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives someone he respects and pities in equal measure. "Cum Tussa isn't just a patient, Victoria. In this city, some names carry weight the moment you say them. His is one of the heaviest." He hesitated, glanced toward the door like he wanted to be sure no one else could hear. "You saved his life on that table. That's not a small thing. Men like that they don't forget, and neither do the men who want him dead." That was the first time anyone said it plainly. That saving a life could put her directly in the path of the people trying to end it. She wanted to ask him more, but a code blue pulled him away before she could, and Victoria was left alone with a cold cup of coffee and a question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since that morning, quietly, insistently, refusing to leave. How had those men known where she lived? Her address wasn't public. It wasn't printed on a badge or a name tag. Someone inside that hospital had given it to them, had handed a stranger's location to men who arrived in black cars before the sun was even fully up. And if someone inside those walls was willing to do that quietly, without hesitation, without a second thought for what it might cost her, what else were they willing to hand over? She didn't have an answer. She filed it away, the way she filed away every hard question that had no immediate solution, and she went back to work, because that was what she knew how to do. She checked on him before her shift ended. She told herself it was professional curiosity, nothing more, a nurse following up on a case that had nearly broken every rule in her training. The ICU was quieter than the rest of the hospital, that particular hush that surrounds a room where the stakes are still uncertain. 2 men stood outside his door who hadn't been there that morning, watching every person who walked the hallway with the flat, unreadable attention of men who were paid to notice things. Through the glass, she could see him. Machines still working around him, a ventilator doing part of the breathing his own lungs weren't ready to manage alone, monitors tracing the rhythm she had fought 9 minutes to give back to him. Tattoos climbed from his collarbone up the side of his neck, dark ink against skin gone pale from blood loss, and even unconscious, even broken open by 3 bullets and hours of surgery. There was something about the stillness of his face that didn't look like weakness. It looked like a man who had simply decided, for the moment, to stop fighting, because he trusted someone else to hold the line while he rested. He hadn't opened his eyes again since that first flicker in the operating room. Dr. Yoon had told her, quietly, that the coma might last hours, might last days, might last longer than that. There was no promise attached to a body that had died twice and come back once already. Victoria pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the observation window, the same hand that had spent 9 desperate minutes pushing life back into his chest, and she stood there longer than she meant to. She told herself she was checking his vitals. She told herself a lot of things. But standing there, watching a stranger's chest rise and fall with borrowed breath, Victoria Troy felt something crack open inside her that had nothing to do with medicine at all. A warmth she hadn't asked for and didn't want, curling quietly beneath the exhaustion and the fear, refusing to be reasoned away. She turned to leave, and that was when one of the men outside the door, the same one who had bowed to her that morning, stepped forward, close enough that only she could hear him, and said 4 words that stopped her cold in the hallway. "He asked for you first." Victoria turned back slowly. "He's in a coma," she said. "He hasn't said anything." The man's expression didn't change. Before the surgery, when they carried him in, he said one name over and over before he lost consciousness. He paused, and something almost like grief passed over his face. Yours, he didn't know it yet, but somehow he already knew it. She stood frozen in that hallway, the machines humming behind the glass, the weight of a stranger's unconscious devotion settling over her like something she hadn't agreed to carry, and understood, with a certainty that frightened her more than the black cars ever could, that whatever this man was, whatever world he came from, she was already too far inside it to walk back out. If you believe a nurse should never be punished for refusing to let a dying man go, hit that like button right now, and subscribe, because Victoria didn't back down that morning, and neither should we. Before we go further, if this story is already sitting in your chest the way it's meant to, I want to put something in front of you. We've got 2 full novels waiting for you right now, the kind of stories that break your heart in one hand and heal it in the other. Love, loss, hope, the journeys that stay with you long after the last page. It's an instant download, a free audiobook included, and every future book we release comes with it. If you're watching this on your TV right now, grab your phone and scan the QR code on your screen. That's the fastest way in. If you're on your phone already, the link is waiting for you in the description and pinned right at the top of the comments. Support the channel, support these stories, and let's keep bringing you the kind of tales you don't just watch, you feel. She didn't walk back out. Not that day, not the day after, and by the time 3 weeks had passed, Victoria had stopped pretending to herself that she was waiting for the chance to. She'd transferred out of the trauma center by the 2nd week, quietly, without drama, filling out the paperwork on a Tuesday morning like it was any other administrative decision. Officially, it was a lateral move to a public health clinic on the other side of the city, better hours, closer to home. Unofficially, Victoria had watched 3 different journalists loiter outside the hospital's front entrance asking staff about the miracle patient in room 4, and she decided she would rather disappear into obscurity than become part of a story that wasn't hers to tell. She wanted her name out of it. She wanted her face out of it. She wanted, more than anything, some version of the quiet life she'd come to soul-chasing in the first place. It didn't work, not the way she'd hoped. The clinic was smaller, humbler, a squat brick building that treated flu shots and diabetic checkups and the occasional emergency that wandered in off the street, nothing like the chaos of the trauma center. Victoria told herself this was safer. Boring, even. Boring had never sounded so good. Then the flowers started. The first arrangement showed up on a Thursday morning, sitting on the clinic's front step before the doors even opened, wrapped in simple brown paper. No card, no note, nothing to identify where it had come from except the flowers themselves. White chrysanthemums, dozens of them, arranged with a precision that told her whoever had put them together hadn't grabbed them off a corner store shelf. Victoria stood in the doorway holding them, turning them over in her hands like the paper itself might confess something, and felt a chill crawl up the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the early morning air. She threw them in the break room trash can. She told herself that was the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, another arrangement. Different flowers this time, deep red camellias, the kind Victoria's mother used to grow in coffee cans on their back porch in Georgia, though there was no way on God's earth anyone in Seoul could have known that. She stood staring at them for a long time before she made herself walk past them into the clinic. By the end of that first week, it wasn't only flowers. A case of surgical gloves in her exact size arrived addressed to the clinic with no return label. Then a box of trauma dressings, the specialized kind, expensive, the kind her underfunded little clinic could never afford on its own budget, exactly the supplies she'd complained about running short of to a coworker in a private conversation she was certain no one else had overheard. Then, strangest of all, a set of compression bandages manufactured by a company she recognized from her training back in the States. Bandages that weren't even sold in South Korea, that she'd have had no way of sourcing locally if she'd wanted to. Someone was watching her. Someone was listening. And whoever it was knew things about her life that she had never said out loud to anyone in this city. Victoria wasn't a woman who scared easily. She'd grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early to read the room, to know which silences meant danger and which ones meant nothing at all. But this careful, patient, deeply personal attention unsettled her in a way that outright threat never could have. A threat, she understood. A threat had rules. This felt like something else. Something that had already decided, somewhere far above her, exactly who she was and exactly what she needed, and was simply waiting for the moment to reveal itself. She asked the clinic's office manager, a soft-spoken woman named Grace who'd worked there for a decade, if she'd seen who dropped off the deliveries. Grace just shook her head, eyes wide. Whoever it is, they come before sunrise. Security camera caught someone once, big man, dark coat, face turned away the whole time. Didn't say a word, just set the box down and left. She hesitated, studying Victoria's face like she was trying to decide whether to say the next part. You got yourself an admirer, Nurse Troy, a serious one. Victoria didn't laugh at that the way she wanted to. Because somewhere in the back of her mind, in that place she didn't like visiting too often, she already knew who it was. She'd known since the second box of gloves. Kim Tisu had woken up. She found out through Dr. Yoon, who called her nearly a month after the surgery. His voice carrying the particular caution of a man delivering news he wasn't entirely sure he should be delivering. Tisu had come out of the coma 11 days earlier. First thing he'd done, apparently once he was lucid enough to speak, was demand to see the security footage from Trauma Room 4, every camera angle, every second, from the moment they'd carried him through the doors to the moment his heart restarted under Victoria's hands. He watched it 17 times, Dr. Yoon said, and there was something almost like awe buried under the unease in his voice. 17 times, Victoria. My colleague who manages hospital security told me himself. Tisu made him replay the CPR sequence over and over, frame by frame, like he was trying to memorize every second of it. Why? Victoria asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't satisfy her even once she heard it. Because he doesn't remember any of it, Dr. Yoon said. Not consciously. He remembers dying. He remembers nothing after that until he opened his eyes and you were the only thing he could see. He wanted to know what happened in between. He wanted to see the woman who wouldn't let him go. He wanted to see her. Not thank her through an assistant, not send a formal letter of gratitude through hospital administration, the way any ordinary man of means might have. He'd watched footage of his own death, over and over, just to understand what a stranger had done for him while he wasn't there to witness it himself. Victoria sat with that for a long moment after she hung up the phone, turning it over the way she'd turned the flowers over that first morning, and somewhere underneath the unease, she felt something else stir that she didn't have a comfortable name for. Not fear exactly. Not flattery either, though God knew it would have been easier to call it that and leave it alone. It felt more like recognition, like she understood, on some level she couldn't fully articulate, what it meant for a man like that to fixate on a moment of pure, uncalculated mercy. In his world, she suspected, mercy without a price tag attached was rare enough to be its own kind of miracle. That was the question that sat with her the rest of that week, quiet and unanswered, threading itself through every shift at the clinic, every gift that arrived at her doorstep. What did a man like Kim Tae-soo actually want from her? Not the flowers, not the medical supplies. Those were easy enough to understand as gratitude, however strange the delivery. What she couldn't work out was what came after the gratitude. Men who commanded that kind of loyalty, that kind of fear, didn't send flowers because they had nothing better to do. There was always a next step in a man like that. She just didn't know yet what it looked like. The black cars found her apartment again on a Sunday evening, nearly a month to the day since the surgery. Victoria came home from a rare day off to find one parked directly across from her building, engine running, windows tinted dark enough that she couldn't see who sat behind the wheel. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, grocery bags cutting into her fingers, deciding whether to walk toward it or straight past it into her building. She walked toward it. The window rolled down halfway before she reached it. Not all the way, just enough for her to see a sliver of the driver's face. Young, unreadable, professionally blank in the way she was starting to recognize as a uniform all its own. "Mr. Kim would like to see you," the driver said, in careful English, the same formal cadence she remembered from that first morning outside her building. "When you are ready, not before." "And if I'm never ready?" Victoria asked. Something shifted behind the driver's eyes, not quite a smile, but close enough to one. "Then he waits," he said simply. "He has been very patient so far, Nurse Troy." The window rolled back up. The car didn't move. Victoria stood on that sidewalk a long time after it pulled away that night, grocery bags forgotten in her hands, staring up at her own dark apartment window like it might offer her some answer her own good sense couldn't. She thought about the flowers, about the compression bandages that shouldn't exist in this country, about a dangerous man watching footage of his own resurrection 17 times, searching a stranger's face for something he couldn't name. She thought about steel-gray eyes finding hers in the middle of chaos, like he already knew her before either of them had said a single word. 3 days later, the gift stopped arriving. No flowers on Thursday morning, no boxes on the clinic's front step. The abrupt silence unsettled her more than the deliveries ever had because silence, in Victoria's experience, rarely meant absence. It usually meant something was about to change. She found out why on a Friday evening, walking home from the clinic in the fatting light, when she noticed the same black car from Sunday parked half a block from her building. Except this time, the back door was open, and a man stood beside it who wasn't the driver. He was tall, dressed simply for a man of his supposed reputation. Dark shirt, no tie, sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that exposed the edge of ink climbing up from his wrist. He stood with the careful, deliberate stillness of someone conserving energy he didn't yet have back in full, one hand resting against the car door like he needed it more than he wanted to admit. Victoria stopped walking. Her heart, which had steadied itself so carefully over the last month, began to hammer against her ribs the way it had the night she'd climbed onto that gurney. Kim Tae-soo turned his head, and in the dying evening light, his eyes found hers exactly the way they had the first time, direct, unflinching, like he'd been waiting his whole life for this specific moment to arrive. "Nurse Troy," he said, his voice low and rough, still carrying the ghost of the ventilator that had breathed for him weeks earlier. "I believe you saved my life." Victoria didn't move, didn't answer. Standing there on a quiet Seoul sidewalk with grocery bags forgotten at her feet, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that whatever door had opened in that operating room 3 weeks ago was about to swing wide open, and there was no version of her old, careful life waiting on the other side of it. She found her voice before she found the will to look away from him. "You shouldn't be standing outside my building," Victoria said, and was almost proud of how steady it came out, given the way her pulse was slamming against her throat. "Probably not," Tae-soo agreed. He didn't move from where he stood beside the car, one hand still braced against the frame, and Victoria understood in that moment that it wasn't performance. The man was genuinely still weak, 3 weeks out from a body that had died on an operating table and been dragged back by sheer stubbornness. He looked like he'd talked his security team into something they hadn't wanted to allow. He looked like a man who did that often. "Then leave," she said. "I intend to." His eyes didn't leave hers. "After I've said what I came to say." Victoria picked her grocery bags up off the sidewalk, mostly to give her hands something to do besides shake, and walked past him toward her building's entrance without answering. She half expected him to follow immediately. He didn't. He gave her exactly enough space that, when she reached her door and turned back, he was still standing by the car, watching her the way a man watches something he isn't sure he's allowed to want. "You can say it from there," she called back. He smiled at that, not a big smile, just the corner of his mouth lifting, like her refusal to make this easy for him was the first thing that had genuinely amused him in weeks. Then he pushed off from the car and started walking toward her, slow and deliberate, favoring his left side just slightly in a way she doubted anyone else would notice. Victoria noticed. She'd spent 3 years learning to read bodies for the truths they told, even when the mouth attached to them was lying. He stopped at the base of the steps, close enough now that she could smell him, cedar and something colder underneath it, metallic almost, like the inside of an operating room, like the smell that clung to her own scrubs after a long shift. 6 feet of quiet authority standing in the dark, and Victoria felt the full weight of it settle over her skin like a change in air pressure before a storm. "You gave me my life back, Nurse Troy," he said. 9 minutes, they told me. 9 minutes where every doctor in that room had already decided I was gone, and you decided I wasn't. That's not something men in my position forget. It's not something we walk away from without settling. "I don't need you to settle anything," Victoria said. "I did my job, that's all it was." Something flickered across his face, not quite hurt, but close enough to it that she felt a small, unwelcome pang of guilt for saying it. "Is that what you tell yourself?" he said quietly. "So you can sleep at night? That it was only a job?" "It has to be," Victoria said, and hated how much truth was buried in the admission. "Because if it's more than that, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with it." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off and cut out again. The rain that had threatened all evening finally started, a thin, cold drizzle that neither of them moved to escape. "May I come up?" Tisu asked. Not a demand. Not the tone of a man accustomed to hearing yes, though Victoria suspected he usually was, but something quieter, almost careful, like he understood exactly how much this particular request was costing him to ask instead of simply take. "No," Victoria said. He nodded, like he'd expected that answer and respected it anyway. "Then I'll say what I need to say here." She crossed her arms, rain starting to beat against her jacket. "Say it." "Your name is out now," Tisu said, and all the warmth that had been threading through his voice a moment earlier disappeared, replaced by something flat and grave. "Not officially, not in any newspaper, but in the circles that matter to men like me, everyone who wanted me dead now knows exactly who pulled me back from it. They know your face. They know where you work. Some of them." He paused, and Victoria watched something pass behind his eyes that looked almost like guilt. "Already know where you live." Victoria's stomach dropped, cold and sudden, the kind of fear that didn't need to be dramatic to be real. "You're telling me I'm in danger because I did CPR." "I'm telling you that you're in danger because you did CPR on me," Tisu said. "There's a difference, and it isn't a small one. The men who want to see me dead understand that I would burn this city to the ground for the person who gave me back my life. That makes you valuable to them. Not because of anything you did to earn it, because of what you mean to me now." "I don't mean anything to you," Victoria said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. "You don't know me. We've said maybe 40 words to each other in our lives." "I know that you didn't hesitate," Tisu said. "I know that when every trained professional in that room had already given up, a woman who owed me nothing climbed onto a table covered in my blood and refused to accept it. I know that you kept going past the point where it made medical sense, past the point of exhaustion, because some part of you couldn't live with the alternative." He took one step closer, close enough now that Victoria had to tilt her chin up slightly to hold his gaze. I have men who have sworn their lives to me who wouldn't have done what you did for a stranger. So don't tell me you don't mean anything. I watched the footage 17 times, Nurse Troy. I know exactly what you mean. Victoria's breath caught somewhere in her chest, and she hated how much it cost her to keep her voice even. Then walk away from me, she said. If you actually care what happens to me, that's the only thing that keeps me safe. Leave and let whoever's watching lose interest. It's too late for that, Tisoo said, and the quiet regret in his voice told her he'd already turned that idea over in his own mind, probably more than once, probably in the sleepless hours since he'd woken from the coma. The moment they saw the footage, the moment they understood what you did walking away from you wouldn't make you invisible. It would only make you unprotected. That was the thought that sat heaviest with Victoria, heavier even than the fear. Somewhere in the space between his warning and his gratitude was a question she hadn't let herself ask out loud yet, not even in the privacy of her own apartment. How far did his world reach? How many people, right now, in the city she'd chosen because it felt far enough from home to finally breathe? How many of them already knew her face, her schedule, the walk she took from the bus stop to her front door every evening? She'd assumed the black cars outside her building were his. It hadn't occurred to her, not fully, not until this exact moment standing in the rain with him, that some of the eyes watching her might not be friendly ones at all. "What do you want from me?" Victoria finally asked, and it came out smaller than she meant it to, less like a demand and more like a genuine question from a woman who had run out of other places to put her fear. Tisoo reached into his jacket, slow and deliberate, the movement of a man who understood exactly how threatening quick movements could look to someone in her position. He held out a phone, sleek, black, unmarked, nothing like the cracked second-hand one currently sitting in her coat pocket. "Encrypted," he said. "Untraceable. If you need anything, if you see anyone unfamiliar, if something feels wrong, if you simply want someone to know where you are, that phone reaches me directly. Not my security team, me." Victoria looked at the phone in his outstretched hand like it might bite her. "I don't want to owe you anything." "You don't," Tisoo said. "This isn't a debt, Nurse Troy. It's not a transaction. I'm not asking for anything in return, and I'm not offering it as a chain to keep you close to me." His voice softened, dropped lower, something raw slipping through the careful control he'd been holding since he first stepped out of that car. "You gave me my life back. Now it belongs to you, whether you want the weight of that or not. I intend to make sure nothing happens to you because of what you did for me. That's not a favor. That's the least a man like me owes to the one person who refused to let him die." Victoria stared at the phone for a long moment, rain soaking steadily through her jacket now, and felt the full, dizzying reality of her situation settle over her. A reality she'd been trying to hold at arm's length for 3 weeks, filed neatly under coincidence and paranoia, and it'll pass. It wasn't going to pass. Whatever this was, whatever world had cracked open the night she'd climbed onto that gurney, it had already reached into her quiet, careful life and rearranged it without asking permission. She didn't take the phone, not yet. "If I say no," she said, "if I tell you I want no part of your world, your protection, any of it, what happens then?" Something in Tisoo's expression shifted, and for just a moment, Victoria saw past the composed, dangerous man standing in front of her, saw something closer to the version of him she'd glimpsed for half a second in that operating room, gray eyes finding hers in the middle of chaos like he already knew her. "Then I respect it," he said quietly. "And I still keep men outside your building every night for as long as it takes for the threat to pass. Whether you want my help or not, Nurse Troy, I am not going to let anything happen to you because you were kind to a dying stranger. That part isn't negotiable." The honesty of it, the sheer, unpolished honesty of a man who by every account should have had no patience left for someone telling him no, undid something in Victoria that she'd been holding tightly closed since the night of the surgery. She reached out and took the phone from his hand, feeling the cool weight of it settle against her palm, and told herself it meant nothing more than practicality. A tool, a safety net, nothing else. But when her fingers brushed his in the exchange, she felt something electric pass between them, quick and undeniable, the kind of current that had nothing to do with medicine or gratitude or debts owed. Tisoo felt it too. She could see it in the way his breath caught, the way his eyes dropped briefly to where their hands had touched before lifting back to hers. "Good night, Nurse Troy," he said, stepping back into the rain, putting careful distance between them like a man forcing himself to walk away from something he badly wanted to stay close to. "Good night," Victoria managed. She watched him walk back to the car, watched the door close behind him, watched the taillights disappear down the wet street before she finally turned and climbed the stairs to her apartment. She locked the door behind her, checked it twice the way she hadn't done in years, and stood in the darkness of her own living room with the encrypted phone still warm in her hand. That was when she noticed it. Cast against her curtains by the streetlight outside, thrown long and unmistakable across the fabric, was a shadow, broad-shouldered, motionless, standing exactly where Tisu's car had been parked only minutes before. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. She crossed to the window in 3 quick steps and yanked the curtain aside. Heart pounding, half expecting to find him still there, waiting. The street was empty. The car was gone. There was no one standing beneath the streetlight at all. And yet, when she turned back toward the room, the shadow was still stretched across her wall, taller now, somehow closer, as though whatever had cast it hadn't left with the car at all, but had simply moved, silent and patient, to somewhere much nearer than the street below. If a woman down on her luck, in a room she couldn't even light, had reached out and pulled a dying stranger back from the edge without asking a single thing in return, what would you have done in her place? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe kindness like that deserves to be protected, not punished, hit subscribe and stay with Victoria, because whatever's casting that shadow isn't finished with her yet. The shadow moved the instant Victoria stepped toward it, sliding sideways across her wall and vanishing into the dark corner by her bookshelf. And for one suspended, terrible second, she was certain something in that corner had moved with it. She snapped on every light in the apartment, hands trembling, checked the corner, checked behind the curtains, checked the narrow gap behind her refrigerator like a woman who'd lost her mind to fear. Nothing. No one. Just her own apartment, lit up bright as an operating room, and the sound of her own heart hammering loud enough to fill the silence left behind. She told herself it was the streetlight, a branch outside her window, maybe, catching the wind and throwing strange shapes against the glass. She told herself this 3 separate times before she finally believed it enough to turn the lights back off and lie down, fully clothed, on top of her covers, staring at the ceiling until exhaustion finally won. 600 miles of coastline away, though in truth it was closer than that, closer than Victoria would ever have wanted to know. A different kind of night was unfolding in a penthouse office on the 40th floor of a glass tower overlooking the Han River. Baek Hyun-woo did not raise his voice. He had learned decades ago that men who shouted were men who had already lost control of a room, and Hyun-woo had never once, in 23 years of building his empire, lost control of a room. He sat behind a desk of black glass, immaculate in a charcoal suit despite the late hour, a single photograph laid flat in front of him beneath the cone of a reading lamp. The photograph showed a black woman with long braided hair standing on a rain-slicked sidewalk, her face turned up toward a man Hyun-woo had spent the better part of a decade trying to destroy. Kim Tisu stood close to her, closer than business required, his hand extended with something small and dark passing between them. The angle was good. Whoever had taken it had been patient, professional, invisible, exactly the kind of man Hyun-woo paid well to remain that way. "Her name," Hyun-woo said, not looking up from the photograph. The man standing at the edge of the desk answered without hesitation. "Victoria Troy, American, trauma nurse, transferred recently to a public clinic in Mapogu. She was on shift the night Tisu was brought in. She performed the resuscitation herself." "Herself," Hyun-woo repeated softly, and something in his tone made the younger man beside him go very still. 9 minutes, my sources tell me. 9 minutes of manual compressions, alone, while trained surgeons stood back and accepted what should have been the end of a very long, very expensive war. He picked the photograph up between 2 fingers, studying it the way a jeweler studies a stone for flaws. Victoria's face was turned toward Tisu in the image, her expression unreadable at that distance. But something about the closeness of the 2 figures, the tenderness in the angle of his hand toward hers, told Hyun-woo everything he needed to know. This wasn't gratitude. Gratitude didn't stand in the rain at midnight exchanging quiet words like lovers reluctant to part. He's protecting her, Hyun-woo said. Personally, not through his lieutenants himself. It would seem so. Hyun-woo set the photograph back down, precisely, squaring its edges with the corner of the desk. For 11 years he had hunted for the crack in Kim Tae-soo's armor, had bribed, threatened, bled, and buried men trying to find the single vulnerability that would finally bring the man's empire to its knees. And Tae-soo had given him nothing. No family left alive to threaten. No weakness anyone could locate, no vice anyone could exploit, no soft place anywhere in that carefully constructed life. Hyun-woo had begun, in his darker private moments, to wonder if the man had simply been built without one. And now here it was, laid out on a glass desk under a reading lamp, in the shape of a foreign nurse who had refused to let death claim its due. He would burn this city down for her, Hyun-woo murmured, almost to himself. Wouldn't he? The younger man didn't answer. He'd learned that some of Hyun-woo's questions weren't questions at all. Watch her, Hyun-woo said finally, sitting back in his chair, folding his hands over the photograph like a man closing a door on a decision already made. Her shifts, her routines, the people she speaks to, the route she walks home. I want to know this woman better than she knows herself. Not yet to touch her, do you understand me? Not yet. His voice remained level, almost gentle, which was precisely what made it terrifying. A weapon like this is not something you fire carelessly. You study it first. You learn exactly where to aim before you ever pull the trigger. And if Tae-soo's men notice the surveillance? Hyun-woo's mouth curved, thin and cold, into something that might have been a smile on a kinder man's face. Then let him notice. Let him understand exactly what I've found, and exactly what it will cost him to protect it. I don't need to put a bullet in Kim Tae-soo to end this war. He looked up, and for the first time that evening, something genuinely alive moved behind his eyes, not rage, but the quiet, patient satisfaction of a hunter who has finally located his prey. I only need to put my hand around the thing he loves and squeeze. They didn't need to shoot Tae-soo if they could target the woman holding his heart. Victoria knew none of this. She woke the next morning with the phone Tae-soo had given her sitting untouched on her nightstand, told herself once again that it meant nothing beyond a practical safeguard, and went to work at the clinic like every other Tuesday of her life. It was 3 days later, in the middle of an entirely unremarkable shift, that the first real crack appeared in the world she'd been trying so hard to keep small and manageable. She'd gone to pull up a patient's file. Routine. A woman coming in for a follow-up on a wound Victoria had dressed the week before, and found the hospital's record system behaving strangely. A login attempt flagged from an unfamiliar device. A file access log showing her own employee credentials used to pull records at 3 a.m., an hour Victoria had been asleep in her apartment with the chain on her door. She sat very still in front of the clinic's ancient computer, staring at the log, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath her the way it had the moment she'd first seen the black cars outside her building. Someone had used her login. Someone with access to her credentials that existed only in the hospital's central system, the same system that connected every clinic and trauma center across the network, had gone digging through records at 3 a.m, and Victoria had a sick, certain feeling she already knew whose file they'd been looking for. She reported it, of course, filed the proper paperwork, flagged it to it, watched a bored technician promise to look into it with the enthusiasm of a man who had heard 100 such complaints that month and expected to hear 100 more. Nobody at the clinic seemed alarmed. Nobody understood, the way Victoria was beginning to, that this wasn't a glitch. This was someone with access to the deepest layers of the hospital network, someone patient enough and careful enough to pull her personal information without leaving obvious fingerprints behind, the kind of someone who didn't work alone, who answered to people far more dangerous than a data breach committee. That was the question that sat with her the rest of that day, unanswered, threading itself into every quiet moment between patients. If someone inside the hospital system had access to her file, had access to her home address, her shift schedule, her emergency contacts, how long had they had it? Had it started the night of the surgery, Or had someone been watching her long before Kim Tae-soo ever came through those doors bleeding out from 3 gunshot wounds? The thought made her stomach turn in a way she didn't have a name for yet. Something colder than fear, something closer to the particular dread of realizing a threat has already been inside your walls for far longer than you understood. She didn't call Tae-soo that night. She told herself it was pride, that she wasn't going to run to a man she barely knew every time something unsettling happened, wasn't going to become the kind of woman who needed rescuing at the first sign of trouble. But underneath the pride was something more honest, something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She was afraid of how badly she wanted to hear his voice. Afraid of how easily, in 3 short weeks, a stranger she'd pulled back from death had become someone whose presence made a frightening world feel, however briefly, survivable. The following morning, walking the 2 blocks from the bus stop to the clinic, Victoria noticed the man on the corner for the 3rd time that week. She might have missed it the first 2 times. Seoul was a city of strangers, after all. Thousands of faces passing each other on any given street, meaning nothing beyond the fact of proximity. But by the 3rd morning, standing at the same corner, wearing a different jacket but the same flat, patient stillness, reading a newspaper he never seemed to turn a page of, Victoria's training kicked in the way it did in a trauma bay when something subtle in a patient's presentation refused to add up. She'd learned, over years of emergency medicine, to trust the part of her mind that noticed wrongness before her conscious brain could name it. She didn't approach him. She didn't call out, didn't confront him the way some braver, more foolish version of herself might have wanted to. She simply walked past, holding her pace steady, and once she was safely inside the clinic, she pulled the encrypted phone from her bag with hands that had gone cold despite the mild morning air. "There's a man watching me," she typed. 3 mornings now, same corner. The reply came back faster than she expected, faster than felt entirely comfortable. Describe him. She did height, build, the newspaper he never read, the jacket that changed but the stillness that never did. She hit send and stood by the clinic's front window, watching the street outside, waiting. "That is not one of my men," the reply finally read, and something in the clipped, immediate certainty of those 5 words made Victoria's blood run cold in a way that 3 weeks of black cars and mystery flowers never had. "Do not leave the clinic alone today. I am sending someone. Stay inside until they arrive." Victoria looked up from the phone, out through the clinic's front glass at the ordinary, sunlit street beyond, mothers pushing strollers, an old man sweeping his shop's entrance, the whole unremarkable rhythm of a city that had no idea what was quietly closing in around one of its nurses. Every hallway of that small clinic, every familiar corner she'd walked 100 times without a second thought, suddenly felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see which direction the danger would come from first. Grace found her still standing at the window 20 minutes later, phone clutched tight in her hand, and asked, gently, if everything was all right. Victoria opened her mouth to say yes, to offer the same careful reassurance she'd been giving everyone for weeks, herself included. But before the words could form, the clinic's front door chimed open, and a man stepped inside wearing scrubs Victoria didn't recognize, a visitor's badge clipped neatly to his chest, a delivery box balanced against one hip like the most ordinary errand in the world. "Delivery for Nurse Troy," he said, in accented English, his eyes finding hers across the waiting room with an intensity that had nothing to do with a simple package. Victoria's stomach dropped straight through the floor, because she recognized, in the careful stillness of his stance, in the flat, professional watchfulness behind his polite smile, exactly the same quality she'd spent 3 mornings learning to fear on that street corner. And she understood, standing frozen in the middle of her own clinic, surrounded by patients who had no idea how close danger had just walked, that whoever was hunting her had stopped watching from a distance. They were already inside the building. The delivery man set the box down on the counter with careful, unhurried hands, and for 3 full seconds Victoria's entire body braced for something she couldn't yet name. A weapon, a threat, some violence she had no way to stop in the middle of a crowded waiting room. Then he simply nodded, said, "Have a good day," in accented English that sounded almost bored, and walked back out through the front door into the ordinary sunlight of the street. Victoria stood frozen for a long moment after the door chimed shut behind him, her heart still hammering, and when she finally made herself walk over and open the box, she found nothing inside but a shipment of standard gauze pads, a perfectly mundane supply order, the kind the clinic received twice a month without fanfare. She almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between relief and hysteria in her throat. Grace touched her arm gently and asked if she needed to sit down, and Victoria realized her hands were shaking so badly she'd nearly dropped the box. She was still shaking 2 hours later when the ambulance call came in. It wasn't unusual for the clinic: car accidents, workplace injuries, the occasional collapse from heat or exhaustion, but something about the dispatcher's voice on this one carried a weight Victoria recognized immediately, the particular gravity reserved for injuries that weren't accidents at all. Female, mid-30s, multiple contusions, possible fractured ribs, found alone in an alley off Idewin Row. Victoria was already pulling on gloves before the ambulance doors opened. The woman they wheeled in was small, delicate-boned, with the kind of bruising that told an entire story to anyone trained enough to read it. Not the scattered, chaotic marks of a mugging or a fall. Deliberate marks. A hand-shaped bruise blooming purple along one forearm, exactly where someone grips to hold a person still. Split skin along one cheekbone, precise, almost surgical in its placement, like whoever had done it had known exactly how much damage to cause without doing enough to require a hospital that might ask harder questions. Victoria had seen this pattern before, more times than she liked to remember, in a different ER in a different country. She knew what it looked like when violence was a message rather than an accident. "Ma'am, my name is Victoria. I'm going to take care of you," she said gently, easing the woman onto the exam table, nodding the way her patient flinched not from pain but from the touch itself, the particular flinch of someone who had learned that gentleness sometimes came with a hidden cost. "Can you tell me your name?" The woman's eyes, dark and glassy with shock, moved slowly around the room, the door, the window, the hallway beyond, cataloging exits the way frightened people did. It took her a long moment before she answered, her English careful and accented. "So-yeon," she said. "My name is Kim So-yeon." Victoria worked methodically, checking ribs, cleaning the wound along her cheekbone, keeping her voice low and steady the entire time. The same voice she'd use on any frightened patient, warm enough to feel safe, calm enough to feel like the world hadn't entirely fallen apart. It was only when she reached for So-yeon's wrist to check her pulse that the woman's hand suddenly closed around Victoria's fingers with surprising strength. "You are her," So-yeon whispered. "The nurse, the one who saved him." Victoria went very still. "I don't know what you mean." "I know your face," So-yeon said, her grip tightening, urgency breaking through the fog of shock in her eyes. "They showed me a photograph. My husband works for the men who did this to me." Her eyes flicked toward the door again, and this time Victoria understood the gesture wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct, honed by someone who had learned the hard way that walls had ears in her world. "Please, close the curtain." Victoria's pulse spiked, but her hands stayed steady out of pure professional habit as she reached over and drew the privacy curtain shut around the exam bay, sealing the two of them into a small pocket of relative safety amid the clinic's ordinary afternoon chaos. "Your husband," Victoria said carefully once the curtain was closed. "Who does he work for?" So-yeon's jaw tightened, and for a moment Victoria thought she might refuse to answer, might let fear win out over whatever desperate courage had brought the words this far. But something in her seemed to break loose, some dam finally giving way after holding back too much for too long. "Baek Hyun-woo," she whispered, and even saying the name seemed to cost her something physical, her shoulders curling inward as if the syllables themselves might summon him into the room. "My husband keeps his books, his real books, not the ones the police would ever see." Her hand found Victoria's wrist again, gripping tighter this time. "They did this to me because he was late with a payment. A warning. Next time, they said, it will be worse. Next time, they said, they will visit our daughter's school instead of our home." Victoria's stomach turned, cold and sick, the particular fury she'd carried since childhood rising hot behind her ribs. the same fury that had once made her risk everything to treat her own brother's gunshot wound off the record, rather than let a broken system fail him the way it had failed so many others. She had left one country to escape violence disguised as order. She had not expected to find its twin waiting for her on the other side of the world. "I'm so sorry," Victoria said, and meant it with her whole chest. "You're safe here. Nobody is going to hurt you in this building." So-yeon let out a small, broken laugh that held no humor in it at all. "Nobody is safe," she said. "Not me, not you, not the man you saved." Her eyes locked onto Victoria's, suddenly sharp and clear despite the pain etched across her face, like the fear had briefly given way to something more urgent, the desperate need to pass a piece of knowledge on before it was too late to matter. "That is why I am telling you this. Because you are already in his sights, and you don't understand yet how close the danger already is." "What do you mean?" Victoria asked, though something cold was already crawling up the back of her neck, some instinct that had been trying to get her attention for days finally sharpening into focus. "There is someone inside your hospital," So-yeon said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing Victoria to lean in close to catch every word. "Someone with access, someone who has been selling information for months, security schedules, staff rosters, patient logs. My husband processes the payments himself. He has seen the ledger entries." Her fingers dug into Victoria's wrist hard enough to leave marks of her own. "They call him the gatekeeper. He is the reason Hyun-woo's men knew exactly which entrance to use the night Kim Tae-soo was brought in wounded. He is the reason they knew which private room to target. He is the reason, Nurse Troy, that they know your schedule down to the exact minute." The room seemed to tilt around Victoria, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright, the antiseptic smell suddenly too sharp. Every question that had been circling her for weeks, the black cars appearing before she'd even told anyone her address, the login attempt at 3 a.m. pulling her personnel file, the man on the street corner who'd known which corner to stand on, all of it collapsed into a single, sickening realization. It hadn't been luck. It hadn't been the natural reach of a dangerous man's resources. Someone had been handing her life over, piece by piece, from somewhere inside the very walls she trusted to keep patients safe. "Do you know who it is?" Victoria asked, her own voice barely steady now. "The gatekeeper, do you have a name?" So-yeon shook her head, wincing at the movement. "No name, only a title and a description my husband once let slip when he thought I wasn't listening. Someone high enough in your hospital's administration to see everything. Someone with access to personnel files, security logs, executive schedules." Her eyes searched Victoria's face with sudden desperation. "Someone who wears a white coat and walks your hallways like he belongs there, because he does. That is what makes him so dangerous. Nobody questions a man who already has every key." Victoria sat back slowly, the full weight of that sentence settling over her like a physical thing. She thought of every executive she passed in the hallways of the trauma center, where she'd spent 3 years of her life. Familiar faces, familiar nods, people she'd trusted enough to hand her own personnel forms to without a second thought. She thought of Chief Administrator Master Choi, the careful, courteous man who oversaw hospital security and staff scheduling, who had personally welcomed her when she'd first transferred from the trauma center, who had access. She realized now, with rising nausea, to precisely the kind of information So-yeon was describing. She thought of the moment nearly a month ago when black cars had appeared outside her apartment building, before she'd told a single soul her address. In this hospital, somewhere, someone she trusted had been selling her life to men who wanted her dead. "You have to help me," So-yeon said, her grip finally loosening as exhaustion began to overtake the adrenaline that had carried her this far. "My husband, if Hyun-woo's men learn I have told you any of this, they will kill him. They will kill both of us." Tears finally broke free, tracing silent lines through the dried blood along her cheek. "I only told you because I could not live with myself, knowing what was coming for you and saying nothing. You saved a man's life without knowing what it would cost you. I could not let it cost you everything, without at least giving you a chance to see it coming." Victoria took the woman's hand gently between both of hers, steadying herself as much as steadying her patient. "I'm going to protect you," she said, with a certainty that surprised even her. "Both of you, I don't know how yet, But I promise you, So-yeon, I am not going to let what you told me today be for nothing. She meant every word, and somewhere underneath the fear, underneath the sick betrayal settling in her stomach, Victoria felt something else rising to meet it, the same fierce, unyielding refusal to accept defeat that had once put her hands on a dying stranger's chest and refused to let go. She had spent her whole career on the side of people the system had failed. She was not about to stop now, not when the system itself had become the danger. She finished treating So-yeon's injuries in careful silence after that, her mind working through the horrifying new shape of her situation, even as her hands moved through the familiar rhythm of gauze and antiseptic and gentle reassurance. When the woman was stable enough to be discharged into the care of a shelter contact Victoria trusted personally, not the hospital's official channels, not anymore, not until she understood exactly how deep the rot went. She watched her go with a heavy, watchful heart, silently praying she'd done enough to keep her safe. It was only once So-yeon was gone, once the curtain was pulled back and the ordinary noise of the clinic rushed back in around her, that Victoria allowed herself to sink onto a stool in the empty exam bay and press both hands over her face. Someone with access to everything, someone in a white coat. She thought of every conversation she'd ever had in the trauma center's break room, every casual mention of her shift schedule, her transfer paperwork, her home address listed neatly on file for emergency contact purposes. She thought of Master Choi's careful smile, his practiced warmth, the way he always seemed to know exactly the right thing to say to put nervous new staff at ease. She had trusted that warmth. She had trusted the whole institution built around it. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a new and terrible question began to take root, when she wasn't ready yet to speak aloud even to herself. If Master Choi truly was the gatekeeper, if the betrayal really did trace back to a man with that much power inside the hospital walls, how many other lives had already been quietly sold along with hers? How many patients, how many staff, how many innocent people had walked those hallways trusting the same institution that had turned around and handed their information to men who dealt exclusively in violence? She reached for the encrypted phone in her bag, hands still trembling, and typed a message she never imagined she'd need to send. I think I know who's been feeding them information. It's someone inside my hospital, someone in administration. I need to talk to you tonight. The reply came back almost instantly, and this time there was no warmth in it at all, only the cold, focused clarity of a man who had just been handed the first real thread in a war he'd been fighting blind for years. Don't say another word about this over text. I'm coming to you. Do not go home alone. Do not trust anyone at that hospital until I get there. Victoria closed her eyes, the weight of the entire day pressing down on her all at once. The delivery man, So-yeon's battered face, the name Master Choi sitting heavy and unwelcome in her chest. And understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than anything else had that day, that the war she'd been trying to stay outside of had just walked straight through her front door wearing a white coat and a familiar, trusted smile. If the thought of a man in a position of trust selling out the very people who depend on him makes your blood boil the way it made mine writing this, subscribe right now, because Victoria is not going to let Master Choi get away with what he's done. Not to her. Not to anyone else walking those hallways trusting the wrong face. And if this story has you sitting on the edge of your seat tonight, I want to make sure you don't leave empty-handed. We've got 2 full, powerful novels waiting for you, stories built to make you feel exactly what you're feeling right now watching Victoria fight for the people she loves. One will break your heart. The other will heal it. It comes with a free audiobook and every future release after it in one instant download. If you're watching on your TV, grab your phone and scan the QR code right on your screen. If you're already on your phone, the link's waiting for you in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Go get it tonight and then come right back, because Victoria still needs you here for what happens next. Tisoo arrived at her apartment less than 40 minutes after her message, and he didn't knock. He simply appeared in the doorway the moment Diho unlocked it from outside, his face carved from something harder than Victoria had seen on him before, eyes moving over her like he was checking for injuries she hadn't told him about. "Pack a bag," he said. "Enough for a week. Nothing that connects to your address, no electronics you haven't already handed to me." "A week," Victoria repeated, standing in the middle of her own living room feeling suddenly, dizzyingly untethered. "Tisu, I have patience tomorrow. I have." "You have a target on your back that I put there," Tisu said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for Victoria to hear the fear underneath the command. "So-yeon risked her life to warn you today. I am not going to let that warning go to waste because you're worried about a shift schedule." Victoria opened her mouth to argue and found, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that she didn't actually want to. She was tired, bone-tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from holding herself together through weeks of watching shadows and counting exits, and some small, quiet part of her recognized that she'd been fighting this moment mostly out of pride, not sense. She packed a bag in 11 minutes. Tisu stood in her doorway the entire time, watching the street below through the gap in her curtains, one hand resting inside his jacket in a way she understood now wasn't casual at all. The safe house sat 40 minutes outside the city, tucked into a fold of hills where the roads narrowed and the lights of Seoul finally gave way to something dark and quiet and unfamiliar. It wasn't what Victoria expected. She'd braced herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, for something cold and fortress-like. Bare walls, armed men, the sterile efficiency of a place built purely for hiding. Instead, the car pulled up to a low stone house wrapped in the smell of pine, warm light glowing behind curtained windows, smoke curling gently from a chimney like the house had been waiting specifically for her. Diho met them at the door, his face unreadable as always, though Victoria caught the flicker of something almost like relief pass through his eyes when he saw Tisu walk in beside her, unharmed. "Perimeter's secure," he said quietly. "6 men rotating shifts. Nobody gets within half a mile without us knowing." His gaze shifted briefly to Victoria, something careful and appraising in it. "Ma'am, you're safe here." "Thank you," Victoria said, and meant it, though the strangeness of being called ma'am by an armed man guarding a house she never expected to need still sat oddly in her chest. Diho left them not long after, murmuring something to Tisu in low Korean that Victoria couldn't follow, and then the door closed and it was just the two of them, standing in a warm, quiet room with a fire crackling low in the hearth, the whole frantic, dangerous world outside finally, blessedly still. Victoria set her bag down slowly, looking around at the modest, comfortable space, nothing like what she'd imagined belonging to a man like him. A worn leather chair by the fire. Shelves of books, some in Korean, some surprisingly in English, their spines cracked from actual reading rather than decoration. A single framed photograph on the mantel, faded with age, showing a woman with kind eyes holding a small boy against her hip. "This isn't what I expected," Victoria admitted. Tisu followed her gaze to the photograph, and something shifted in his face, a door easing open that she sensed didn't open often. "This was my mother's house," he said quietly. "Before Seoul, before any of it." He moved to the fire, added a log with careful, deliberate hands, the same hands Victoria had watched hold a gun with equal precision. "I come here when I need to remember who I was before I became what I am now." Victoria sat slowly in the chair across from him, pulling her knees up beneath her the way she used to as a girl on her grandmother's porch back home, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The fire popped and settled. Outside, wind moved through the pines, and somewhere beyond that, she knew, 6 armed men stood quiet watch over a house holding the 2 people the entire city seemed determined to tear apart. But inside, in that small, warm room, none of it felt close enough to touch. "Tell me about her," Victoria said softly, nodding toward the photograph. "Your mother." Tisu was quiet long enough that Victoria wondered if she'd overstepped, if she'd pushed against a door he wasn't ready to open all the way. But then he sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, and began to speak in a voice stripped of all the careful authority she'd grown used to hearing from him. "She raised me alone," he said. "My father was already gone by the time I could walk, not dead, just gone, the way men sometimes decide their families are burdens they'd rather set down. She worked in a fish market in Blasian, 6 days a week, hands cracked and raw from the cold water, and she never once let me see her cry about any of it." He turned his forearm over, and for the first time, Victoria understood she was being invited to really look at the ink covering his skin, not just notice it in passing. "This one," he said, tracing a finger along a cluster of small, precise characters near his wrist, "is her name. I had it done the week she died. I was 19. "What happened to her?" Victoria asked gently. "Men came to collect a debt my father left behind before he disappeared," Tisu said, and his voice had gone flat now, the particular flatness of a wound that had scarred over without ever properly healing. "She didn't have the money. She never had the money. They didn't care." He was quiet a moment, staring into the fire. "I was in the next room. I heard everything. I was 17 years old, and I was too small, too weak, too powerless to stop 3 men from beating my mother to death over a debt that wasn't even hers to pay." Victoria felt her chest crack open, felt tears rise fast and unwelcome, and she didn't bother fighting them back the way she might have with anyone else. "Tisu," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." "I swore that night," he continued, like he hadn't heard her, like the memory had carried him somewhere she couldn't quite reach, "that I would never again be the powerless boy in the next room. I built everything I have since then out of that promise. Every deal, every alliance, every act you would call ruthless, all of it. Built so that no one who belonged to me would ever again be beaten to death while I stood helpless and listened." He finally looked up at her, and the rawness in his eyes stole the breath from her lungs. "You asked me once what I want from you. This is the truth of it, Victoria. I built an empire so I would never have to bury someone I loved again. And then you climbed onto a table covered in my blood and refused to let death take me. And for the first time in 20 years, I understood I might lose everything I built anyway, because I could survive losing my own life. I don't think I could survive losing yours." The confession hung in the warm air between them, raw and unguarded in a way Victoria understood, with sudden, aching clarity, that this man never allowed himself to be. Not with his lieutenants, not with his enemies, perhaps not with anyone since the night he lost his mother. She rose from her chair without deciding to and crossed the small distance between them, kneeling in front of him the way she might kneel beside a patient, except this had nothing to do with medicine at all. She reached out and took his hand, the same hand that had held a gun, signed death warrants, built an empire out of grief, and pressed her palm flat against his, tracing the ink along his knuckles with gentle fingers. "This one," she said softly, touching a small, weathered scar half hidden beneath the tattoos along his forearm. "Tell me about this one." Tisu's breath caught, and for a long moment he simply looked at her hand against his skin, at the tenderness in her face that asked for nothing except to understand him. Like he'd forgotten, somewhere along the way, that kindness could exist without a price attached to it. "A knife," he said quietly. "My first year on the streets before anyone respected me enough not to test it. I was 15. I didn't have anyone to stitch it closed, so I did it myself, badly, with a sewing needle and thread I stole from a market stall." He watched her trace the crooked scar, watched her professional eye assess the poor healing with an ache she couldn't hide. "Nobody has ever looked at these the way you're looking at them now." "How do people usually look at them?" "Like a warning," Tisu said. "Like a resume of every terrible thing I've survived and every terrible thing I'm capable of doing to survive the next threat. Nobody has ever looked at my scars and seen a boy who needed someone to hold him while he bled." His voice dropped lower, rougher, something breaking open in it that Victoria suspected he hadn't let break in a very long time. "You keep looking at me like there's still something in here worth saving." "There is," Victoria said, and the certainty in her own voice surprised her, arrived without hesitation, without the careful professional distance she'd spent weeks trying to maintain. "I didn't spend 9 minutes fighting for your heartbeat because I thought you were a good man, Tisu. I did it because every life is worth fighting for. But I've spent the last month learning who you actually are underneath all of it, and I think—" Her voice caught, and she let herself be as unguarded as he'd just been with her. "I think I was fighting for exactly the right person, even if I didn't know it yet." Tisu reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that had done so much violence. "Victoria," he said, her name coming out like something sacred in his mouth. I have spent my entire life building walls so high that no one could ever reach far enough to hurt me the way those men hurt my mother. And you climbed over every single one of them without even trying." "I wasn't trying to climb anything," Victoria admitted, tears finally slipping free down her cheeks. "I was just trying not to let a stranger die on my table. I didn't know I'd end up here, kneeling in a stranger's house, listening to the loneliest man I've ever met tell me about a knife wound he stitched himself at 15 years old, feeling like—" She stopped, pressing her lips together, afraid of the words waiting behind her teeth. "Feeling like what?" Tisu asked, barely a whisper now, his forehead nearly resting against hers. "Feeling like I don't want to leave," Victoria admitted. "Even though every part of my training tells me I should keep my distance. Even though loving a man like you might be the most reckless thing I've ever done in my entire life, I don't want to leave." Tisu made a sound, then that Victoria would remember for the rest of her life. Something between a laugh and a sob. The sound of a man who had spent 2 decades believing himself unlovable finally hearing otherwise from someone who had earned the right to say it. He pulled her gently into his arms, and Victoria let herself be held, let herself feel, for the first time since she'd stepped off a plane in Seoul 3 years ago chasing a life free of fear. What it meant to be safe not because of walls or armed men outside a door, but because someone had finally seen every scarred, guarded part of her and chosen to stay anyway. They stayed like that a long time, the fire burning low, the wind moving quiet through the pines outside. 2 people who had both learned the hard way that love and danger often arrived wearing the same face. And for once, neither of them was in a hurry to let go. It was well past midnight when Tisu finally spoke again, his voice low and thoughtful against her hair, some of the earlier vulnerability giving way to a more careful, considering tone. "Master Choi has worked in that hospital for 11 years, he said quietly. "I had my people look into his finances the moment you told me his name." Victoria lifted her head, some of the warmth of the evening giving way to the cold reality waiting outside their small circle of firelight. "And he's clean," Tisu said. "On paper, at least. No unusual deposits, no debts, nothing that would explain why a respected administrator would risk everything to sell information to a man like Hyun Woo." He was quiet a moment, something troubled moving behind his eyes. "Which means either So-yeon's husband was wrong about who's feeding the information. Or Master Choi is very good at hiding it," Victoria finished. "Or," Tisu said slowly, "the gatekeeper isn't Master Choi at all. Which means we've spent tonight looking at the wrong white coat, and the real traitor is still walking your hospital's halls completely unwatched, closer to you, perhaps, than either of us wants to imagine." Victoria didn't sleep after that. She lay awake beside Tisu in the quiet dark of the safe house, his breathing slow and even against her shoulder, and let her mind do the thing it had always done best under pressure, work the problem instead of running from it. Closer than either of them wanted to imagine. That was the phrase that wouldn't let her rest. If Master Choi wasn't the gatekeeper, then someone else, someone she likely walked past every single day, someone whose face she probably trusted without a second thought, was quietly feeding her life to a man who wanted her dead. She was still turning it over 3 days later when the call came through Tisu's encrypted line, urgent and clipped, pulling him out of the small kitchen where he'd been making coffee with the careful, almost boyish concentration of a man still relearning how to exist in ordinary domestic moments. Deho's voice carried through the speaker, tight with the particular tension Victoria had learned to recognize as real. "We've got a source inside Hyun Woo's logistics network. Says there's a shipment coming into Incheon Harbor tonight, weapons, cash, enough product to fund 6 months of operations. If we hit it before it makes port, we cripple his supply chain for the rest of the year." Victoria watched Tisu's face shift as he listened, watched the careful calculation move behind his eyes, the particular focus of a man already 3 steps into a plan. "Coordinates," he said. "Pier 14, North Dock. Source says security will be light. Hyun Woo's pulled most of his enforcers back to the east side this week, some kind of internal restructuring. It's the best opening we've had in months." Tisu ended the call and turned to find Victoria already standing in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, watching him with an expression he'd learned by now not to dismiss. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's the opportunity I've been waiting a year for," Tisu said. "If we take that shipment, we take away the money funding every threat against you. Every man watching your hospital, every informant on his payroll, all of it dries up without the cash flow to sustain it. And if it's a trap..." Something flickered across his face, not dismissal, but the particular impatience of a man whose instincts had kept him alive for 2 decades and had learned to trust them absolutely. "Diho's source has been reliable for 3 years. Hyun-woo doesn't know we have someone inside his logistics chain. There's no way he could know we're coming." Victoria said nothing more in that moment, but the unease sat heavy in her chest for the rest of the morning, following her from room to room like a shadow she couldn't quite name. She'd learned, over 3 years in trauma medicine, to trust the particular prickle at the back of her neck that showed up before a patient crashed, the instinct that noticed wrongness in a chart before her conscious mind could articulate why. That same prickle was working overtime now, and she didn't yet understand what it was trying to tell her. It was nearly noon, while Tisu met with Diho and 2 of his senior men in the safe house's main room, planning routes and timing with the low, focused efficiency of soldiers preparing for battle, that Victoria found herself instead pulled toward the small desk in the corner where she'd left her tablet, still logged into the clinic's supply portal from 3 days earlier. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She simply needed something to occupy her hands and her mind, while the men in the next room planned an assault she couldn't stop and didn't fully trust. She scrolled absently through the pending orders, gauze, saline, the usual mundane rhythm of a clinic's daily needs, and was about to close the tablet entirely when something snagged her attention, small and easy to miss, the kind of detail that would mean nothing to anyone without her specific training. A supply requisition, filed 2 days earlier, for the main trauma center, not her small clinic, the original hospital where she'd spent 3 years before her transfer. Nothing unusual in that on its face. Hospitals ordered supplies constantly, but the specific items caught her eye and refused to let go. A bulk order of surgical trauma kits, mass casualty triage supplies, an unusually large restock of blood products across every major type. The kind of order a hospital placed when it was quietly preparing for something significant. The kind of order Victoria herself had helped process more than once during her years in the trauma center, back when a mass shooting or a building collapse meant the ER needed to brace for an overwhelming influx all at once. She sat very still, staring at the screen, her mind working through the timing with the same clinical precision she'd once used to read a chart for the detail everyone else had missed. The order had been placed 2 days ago. The tip about the Incheon shipment had come in only this morning. That meant whoever authorized that trauma supply order hadn't known about tonight's operation at all. They'd known something else entirely, something planned well before Diho's source ever whispered a word about a shipment at the docks. Unless the supply order and the docks were connected in a way nobody, in that planning room, had yet considered. Victoria's pulse quickened, the pieces beginning to slide into place with the particular electric clarity she recognized from every moment in her career when a diagnosis finally clicked, when scattered symptoms suddenly resolved into a single, undeniable cause. She scrolled further back through the requisition history, cross-referencing dates, and found what she was looking for buried 3 pages deep. A staffing memo, filed the same day as the supply order, temporarily reassigning nearly a third of the trauma center's security personnel to what the memo vaguely described as external logistics support for the following week. A third of the hospital's security, reassigned. The same week Diho's source had conveniently surfaced with intelligence about weakened security at the docks. Victoria stood so abruptly her chair scraped hard against the floor, and she was already moving toward the main room before she'd fully finished putting the pieces together in her own mind, tablet clutched tight against her chest. "Tisu," she said, cutting straight through whatever tactical discussion had been unfolding around the table. "I need you to look at something." He turned toward her immediately, reading the urgency in her face the way he'd learned to read every shift in her mood over the past week. "What is it?" "The docks," Victoria said. "It's not real, or it's real but it's not the target, it's the distraction." Deho straightened, his expression sharpening into something skeptical but attentive. "Our source has been reliable for 3 years." "I'm not saying your source is lying," Victoria said, setting the tablet down on the table between them, pulling up the requisition order with hands that had gone steady the moment her mind locked onto the problem, the same steadiness that had once let her perform compressions for 9 unbroken minutes without her hands ever shaking. "I'm saying whoever gave your source that tip wanted you to hear it, because it points your attention exactly where they need it pointed, away from here." She tapped the screen. "This order was placed 2 days ago. Mass trauma supplies, blood products across every type. The kind of order a hospital places when someone with inside knowledge expects an incoming wave of serious casualties." She pulled up the staffing memo next. "And this, filed the same day, pulls a third of the trauma center's security detail off-site for the week. The same week you're being told Hyun Woo's men are thin on the ground at the docks." Tisu went very still, his eyes moving rapidly over the documents on the screen, the tactical part of his mind already racing ahead of the rest of the room. "You're saying the docks are a decoy." "I'm saying somebody already knows exactly what you're planning to do tonight," Victoria said. "And they've spent the last 2 days quietly preparing the hospital for something much bigger than a dockside raid. If your men pull out to hit that shipment, and half the trauma center's security is already reassigned elsewhere." She let the sentence hang, watching the same realization she just reached ripple across every face in the room. "The hospital is the real target," Deho said slowly, the color draining slightly from his face. "Not the docks. He's clearing us out of the city so he can hit the one place he knows you'll never leave unprotected." "The ICU," Tisu said, and Victoria watched something cold and furious settle behind his eyes. "You're still listed as a patient of record there, discharged on paper, but every nurse, every administrator, every record in that system still shows you spent weeks in that ward." He looked at Victoria with an expression somewhere between horror and awe. "He's not planning to hit the docks tonight. He's planning to hit the ICU, while every one of my men is 30 miles away chasing a shipment that was never meant to matter." The room fell into a sudden, sharp silence, the kind that came only in the seconds after a plan built over days had been unraveled and rebuilt in less than 5 minutes flat. Deho stared at Victoria with something new in his expression, not the polite deference he'd shown her before, but genuine, startled respect, the look of a man who'd spent years building intelligence networks only to be outpaced by a nurse reading a supply order. "How did you see this?" Deho asked, "when 3 of my best men reviewing the same intelligence saw nothing at all?" "Because your men were trained to look for soldiers and weapons," Victoria said quietly. "I was trained to look for the small signs that tell you something catastrophic is coming before anyone else in the room notices. A hospital preparing quietly for mass casualties leaves a trail, if you know where to look for it. I've spent 3 years learning exactly where that trail hides." Tisu crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pulled her into his arms, not with romance in the gesture, but with the raw, urgent gratitude of a man who understood exactly how close they'd all come to walking blind into disaster. "You just saved every one of us," he said against her hair. "Again." "We don't have time for that yet," Victoria said, though she allowed herself one brief moment to hold on to him before pulling back, her mind already racing 3 steps ahead toward the next problem. "If the hospital really is the target, we need to know exactly when they're planning to move, and we need eyes on that ICU immediately, not weakened security, not a skeleton crew hopping nothing happens. If Hyun Woo's men are already planning to exploit that gap, we might not have until tonight. We might not even have until this afternoon." Tisu was already reaching for his phone, dialing Deho's second-in-command with sharp, urgent instructions in rapid Korean. Redirecting men who had spent the entire morning preparing for an assault on empty docks, toward a target none of them had seen coming, until Victoria laid it bare on a tablet screen. The energy in the room shifted entirely, tactical focus replacing the earlier confidence, every man present recalibrating around a threat that suddenly felt far closer and far more personal than a warehouse full of contraband 30 miles from the city. Victoria stood in the middle of the controlled chaos, watching Tisu's men mobilize around her, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had nothing to do with fear at all. A sharp, focused clarity, the same steady purpose that had once driven her onto a gurney to fight for a stranger's heartbeat. She wasn't a bystander in this war anymore, wasn't simply a woman being protected from a danger she didn't understand. She had just proven, in the space of 5 urgent minutes, that she belonged in that room every bit as much as the men with guns and tactical training. But even as the plan reshaped itself around her, even as Diho barked orders into his phone, and Tisu pulled up a floor plan of the hospital on the tablet screen, one question sat cold and unanswered at the back of Victoria's mind, refusing to be silenced by the urgency of the moment. Whoever had orchestrated this, whoever had known enough about hospital logistics to time a supply order and a staffing memo with such surgical precision, understood the inner workings of that trauma center far too intimately to be some outside operative working from a distance. Whoever had planned tonight's attack on the ICU wasn't just working for Hyun-woo. They were already standing inside the building. That question was still sitting unanswered in Victoria's chest 3 hours later, when she insisted on going to the hospital herself. Tisu had argued against it, hard, for nearly 20 minutes, his composure fraying in a way Victoria had never seen from him before. But Victoria had held her ground with the same stubborn certainty she'd used to climb onto a dying man's gurney against every protocol in the building. Grace and 3 other staff members were on shift at the clinic tonight, and if Hyun-woo's people were truly planning to exploit weakened hospital security, she wasn't going to sit safely in a stone house in the hills while people she cared about walked unknowingly into danger she could have warned them about. In the end, Tisu had relented on one condition. She went nowhere without Diho's men flanking her, and she carried the encrypted phone with a single button that would summon every armed man he had within minutes. The storm rolled in just after 9, exactly the kind of violent, close-fisted soul downpour that had carried Tisu through those trauma center doors nearly 2 months earlier. Thunder cracking low over the city like the sky itself remembered what had happened the last time weather like this found her in a hospital. Victoria was midway through checking a patient's chart in the trauma center's East Wing. She'd come to review overnight staffing personally, unwilling to trust anyone else's eyes but her own after everything she'd uncovered, when the lights died. Not flickered, not dimmed the way they did during an ordinary power fluctuation. They died all at once, the entire building plunging into a darkness so total and so sudden that for one disorienting heartbeat, Victoria's mind flashed back to the moment a monitor had flatlined in Trauma Room 4, that same hollow, absolute silence swallowing everything alive around her. Then the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the corridors in a low, bloody red that turned every familiar hallway into something unrecognizable. Shadows stretching long and strange across walls Victoria had walked 100 times without a second thought. Alarms began shrieking somewhere deep in the building's systems, the confused, layered chorus of a hospital's backup, generators fighting to compensate for a total outage that should never have happened during a routine storm. Victoria's pulse spiked, every instinct she'd spent weeks sharpening screaming the same warning at once. This wasn't weather. Storms didn't kill main power and backup power in the same breath, didn't time themselves so precisely to a night when a third of the hospital's security detail had already been quietly redirected elsewhere. She grabbed the radio clipped to a nearby nurse's station, hands steady out of pure trained instinct even as her heart hammered. "This is Troy, East Wing. Can anyone confirm what's happening with main power?" Static answered her first, then a burst of garbled, frightened chatter from somewhere in the building's core. And beneath it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of glass shattering, followed by raised voices speaking rapid Korean that carried none of the careful courtesy she'd grown used to from Tisu's men. They were already inside. Victoria's training took over before fear could fully claim her, the same clean, focused calm that had once let her perform 9 unbroken minutes of compressions without her hands ever trembling. She she reminded herself, unarmed in the way an ordinary civilian might be. She knew this building better than any stranger with a gun ever could. She'd walked these halls for 3 years, memorized every supply closet, every stairwell, every blind corner where a body could disappear from view in half a second. If Hyun-woo's men had come expecting an easy, disoriented target, they had badly miscalculated exactly who they were hunting. She moved fast and low through the darkened corridor, pressing herself against the wall near the nurse's station, listening past the shriek of alarms for the pattern of footsteps closing in from the west stairwell. Heavy, deliberate, at least 4 men, moving with the confident carelessness of soldiers who expected no resistance from a building full of doctors and patients. A nurse knows every shadow in her hospital better than any soldier. Victoria ducked into the supply corridor that ran parallel to the main hallway, a narrow service passage most visitors never even noticed, built for moving equipment between wards without disturbing patient traffic. It ran directly past the hospital's central pharmacy, and Victoria, moving through the dark with the sure, practiced steps of someone who'd stocked those shelves herself more nights than she could count, knew exactly what sat in the storage unit at the pharmacy's rear wall. She reached the pharmacy door in under a minute, breath tight in her chest, and worked the emergency override with fingers that barely shook despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Inside, the shelves loomed dark and towering around her, familiar shapes rendered strange by the bloody emergency light bleeding in from the hallway. She found what she needed on the 3rd shelf back, a case of chemical smoke canisters, the kind used in hospital fire drills to simulate emergency evacuation conditions, thick and disorienting, designed to reduce visibility to almost nothing within seconds of activation. Footsteps grew louder behind her, closing in on the main corridor. Victoria's hands moved fast, pulling 3 canisters free, running the emergency drill protocol through her mind the way she'd run it a dozen times in training exercises that had never once felt this urgently real. She heard the first shout in Korean just as she reached the pharmacy's side entrance, a voice calling out something sharp and directional. "She's here. Check the pharmacy." Close enough now that Victoria's whole body went cold with the certainty that she had seconds, not minutes, before armed men filled the doorway behind her. She pulled the pin on the first canister and rolled it back down the main corridor she'd just come from, then pulled the second and sent it the opposite direction down the service passage, thick white smoke billowing out instantly, swallowing the bloody emergency light whole, turning the narrow hallway into a churning, impenetrable fog. Shouts of confusion erupted almost immediately, men coughing, calling out to each other in rapid, disoriented Korean, boots scraping against tile, as they lost their bearings in a hallway Victoria could have navigated blind. Because she nearly was navigating it blind, smoke stinging her own eyes, throat burning, but she'd had the foresight the drills always drilled into staff, and she pressed a folded cloth against her mouth and nose, counting doorways by memory instead of sight, moving low and fast toward the stairwell she knew led down toward the loading dock, away from the men now stumbling and cursing in the fog behind her. A hand closed around her arm from the darkness, and Victoria's whole body seized with terror before she registered the voice hissing urgently in accented English. "Nurse Troy, this way, quickly." It was one of the hospital's own security guards. Young, terrified, his flashlight beam cutting weakly through the smoke. "4 men came through the loading dock," he gasped, pulling her toward a side stairwell. They knew the code to the back entrance. They knew exactly where to cut the cameras. Someone gave them the layout. Someone gave them the layout. The words landed like a physical blow even in the middle of the chaos, confirming everything Victoria had feared since the moment she'd cross-referenced that supply order 3 hours earlier. Whoever had planned this hadn't guessed at the hospital's blind spots. They'd been handed them, drawn out precisely, by someone who'd walked these same halls with a badge and a trusted face. They made it 2 flights down before the sound of boots above them told Victoria the men had regrouped and were moving again, faster now, no longer disoriented by the smoke, but clearly furious about the delay it had cost them. She pressed the young guard back against the stairwell wall, held a finger to her lips, and listened as the footsteps passed the landing above without slowing. Heading, she realized with a fresh spike of fear, not toward the exits, but deeper into the building, toward the ICU wing where her own patient records, however outdated, still listed her as a former ward. They weren't just hunting her randomly through dark corridors. They were following a map someone had drawn for them in advance. Victoria's hand found the encrypted phone in her scrub pocket, and she pressed the emergency contact with trembling fingers, praying the signal held through the storm and the chaos both. "They're inside," she whispered the moment the line connected, not waiting for a greeting. "West stairwell, moving toward the ICU. At least 4 men, maybe more. They know the building, Tisu. They know it like someone drew them a map." "We're 3 minutes out," Tisu's voice came back, tight and controlled despite the fury she could hear straining underneath it. "Diho's men are already breaching the east entrance. Victoria, listen to me, find somewhere to hold. Do not try to reach an exit alone. Do you understand me? 3 minutes." 3 minutes had never felt so impossibly long in Victoria's entire life. She guided the young guard further down the darkened stairwell. Both of them pressed low against the wall, breath held, listening to the muffled chaos unfolding somewhere above them. Shouted commands, the distant crash of something heavy overturned, the particular electric tension of a building holding its breath through violence it had never been built to withstand. Then, cutting through it all, sharp and close enough to freeze the blood in Victoria's veins, came the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Once, twice, echoing hard off tile and concrete, followed immediately by shouting voices that were no longer speaking only Korean. Diho's men had arrived. The stairwell door above them burst open with a violent crash, and Victoria pulled the young guard deeper into the shadow of the landing, her heart slamming against her ribs so hard she was certain it could be heard over the chaos erupting just 1 flight above her head. Boots pounded down the stairs, too fast, too close. No time left to run, no time left to hide anywhere, but exactly where they were pressed flat against cold concrete, praying the darkness would hold just long enough. A flashlight beam swept across the landing above them, paused, and began tracking slowly, deliberately, down toward the very stairwell where Victoria crouched frozen. One hand pressed hard over the terrified guard's mouth, the other gripping the phone that had gone suddenly, ominously silent in her palm. The flashlight beam swept past the landing without slowing, catching nothing but concrete and shadow, and the boots kept moving, thundering down past them toward the lower levels. Diho's men. Victoria realized a heartbeat later, recognizing the shouted command that followed, sharp and familiar, calling for the stairwell to be cleared and secured. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for what felt like a lifetime, her hand finally easing away from the young guard's mouth. "They're ours," she whispered, though her heart hadn't yet caught up to the relief her mind was trying to offer it. They stayed pressed against the landing another full minute before Victoria trusted her legs enough to move, guiding the trembling guard down toward the lower levels where Diho's men had already begun sweeping the building floor by floor, calling out clearances in clipped, efficient Korean. The chemical smoke had begun to thin by then, curling lazily toward the ceiling vents, and through the haze Victoria could see the shape of the raid unfolding. Hyunwoo's men, disarmed and zip-tied along the east corridor wall, faces slack with the particular defeat of soldiers who'd walked into what they thought was an easy target and found themselves outmatched instead. She didn't see Tisu anywhere among them. "Where is he?" she asked the first of Diho's men she reached, urgency sharpening her voice past the exhaustion trying to claim her. "Where's Tisu?" The man's expression flickered, uncertain in a way that sent fresh dread pooling cold in Victoria's stomach. "He went to the parking structure," he said. "Word came through that Master Choi's car was seen leaving through the lower garage right before the power went out. Mr. Kim went after him alone, said there wasn't time to wait." Alone? Victoria didn't remember deciding to run. She simply found herself moving, pushing past startled hospital staff and armed men alike, taking the stairwell down 2 steps at a time toward the subterranean garage, her mind refusing to let go of one single, terrible thought. If Master Choi truly was the gatekeeper, if he'd been the one feeding Hyunwoo the layout of this hospital for months, then a cornered traitor with nothing left to lose was exactly the kind of man capable of anything. The parking garage was worse than the hallways above. No emergency red glow down here. Only the weak, flickering beam of a single backup light struggling against total darkness. The storm's thunder rolling distantly overhead like the building itself was holding its breath. Victoria's footsteps echoed off concrete as she moved between rows of parked cars, straining to hear past the pounding of her own pulse. And it was the sound of a voice, low, controlled, unmistakably Tisu's, that finally drew her toward the far corner of the lower level. She rounded a concrete pillar and stopped cold. Master Choi stood pressed against the hood of his own car, his usually immaculate suit disheveled, sweat gleaming on his forehead despite the cold of the garage. In his shaking hand, he held a gun, leveled unsteadily at Tisu, who stood perhaps 10 feet away with his own weapon lowered at his side, palms open, his voice carrying the particular calm of a man who had talked his way out of far worse situations than this one. "You don't want to do this, Master Choi," Tisu said quietly. "Put the gun down. Whatever Hyun-woo promised you, it isn't worth what happens next if you pull that trigger." "He promised my daughter's medical debt would be forgiven," Master Choi said, and his voice cracked on the words, revealing something raw and desperate beneath the careful administrator's composure Victoria had trusted for years. 3 years of treatments, Mr. Kim. 3 years, and the hospital board wouldn't waive a single fee for the man who ran their own security. Do you understand what that does to a father? Watching your child suffer while the people you serve refuse to lift a finger. His grip tightened on the gun, hands trembling badly enough that Victoria's trauma-trained eye recognized immediately how dangerously unpredictable that made him. "Hyun-woo offered me a way to save her. I didn't want any of this. I never wanted anyone hurt." "Nurse Troy has never hurt anyone in her life," Tisu said, his voice hardening now, the calm giving way to something colder. "You handed a good woman's life to a man who wanted her dead, over and over, for months. Whatever pain drove you to it, that choice was still yours to make. And now you're going to put that gun down before you make a choice you can't undo." Master Choi's eyes darted sideways in that moment, and Victoria watched them land directly on her, half hidden behind the pillar where she'd frozen, and something desperate and unraveling moved across his face. The look of a cornered man realizing his last card had just walked into the room. "Nurse Troy," Master Choi said, his voice climbing toward panic now, the gun swinging unsteadily in her direction. "You shouldn't be down here." "Choi," Victoria said, stepping forward despite every instinct screaming at her to stay hidden, her voice carrying the same steady, grounded calm she used with terrified patients in the worst moments of their lives. "I know about your daughter. I've seen her chart. I know how hard you fought for her." She kept her hands visible, kept her voice gentle even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "But this isn't the way to save her, and you know it. If you hurt me, if you hurt him, there's no version of this where your daughter gets her father back. Put the gun down. Let us help you the right way." For one long, suspended moment, something in Master Choi's face wavered, the exhausted, broken father underneath the traitor's white coat finally surfacing, torn between the desperate promise Hyun-woo had made and the quiet, dignified plea of a woman he'd betrayed, but who was still, somehow, offering him a way out. Then his jaw hardened, and Victoria watched him make the wrong choice. The gun swung fully toward her, his finger tightening against the trigger with the jerky, panicked motion of a man who'd already convinced himself there was nothing left to lose. And in the half-second before the shot could fire, before Victoria's body had even finished processing the danger, a shadow moved faster than thought through the darkness between them. Tisu closed the distance in a single fluid motion, driving Choi's gun arm upward and sideways with brutal, practiced precision at the exact instant the weapon discharged. The shot cracking off the concrete, sealing harmlessly overhead in a burst of sound that seemed to swallow the entire garage whole. Choi's cry of pain followed almost instantly as Tisu's other hand drove hard into his wrist, the gun clattering uselessly across the concrete floor, and then Choi himself was on the ground, pinned beneath a knee and a grip that left absolutely no room for further resistance. "You promised no one would touch her," Tisu said, low and lethal, pressing Choi flat against the cold concrete. And you nearly proved me a liar in front of the one person I could never forgive myself for failing." Victoria's legs finally gave out from beneath her, not from injury, but from the sheer, overwhelming release of adrenaline crashing all at once, and she sank against the nearest pillar, breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. Tisu was at her side within seconds, Choi secured and disarmed behind him, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the violence he'd just used to protect her. "I'm here," he said softly, forehead pressed to hers. "You're safe, I have you." "I thought," Victoria's voice broke, the fear she'd been holding at bay through smoke and gunfire and stairwells finally catching up to her all at once. "I thought he was going to shoot you." "He was never going to get the chance," Tisu said, fierce and certain, pulling her into his chest. "I told you once your life belonged to you because of what you gave me. I meant every word of it. I would not have let anything happen to you tonight, not while I still had breath left in my body to stop it." Above them, the sound of Diho's men clearing the last of the garage echoed down the concrete stairwell, followed shortly by Diho himself, radio in hand, his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man delivering good news after a long, brutal night. "It's done," he said, kneeling briefly to check the zip ties securing Master Choi before straightening to face Tisu. "Hyun-woo's strike team surrendered the moment they realized we'd already breached the east entrance. 6 men in custody, including the 2 who cut the power. We recovered a burner phone off their lead man with direct communication logs back to Hyun-woo himself. His mouth curved into something grim and satisfied. We have everything we need now to end this permanently, not just tonight's raid, the entire war." Victoria lifted her head from Tisu's chest, still trembling but steadying with every passing second, and looked toward Master Choi where he lay defeated and broken on the cold garage floor, a man who'd sold out everything he'd sworn to protect for a desperate father's love gone catastrophically wrong. She felt no triumph looking at him. Only a deep, aching sorrow for the daughter who would grow up knowing exactly what her father had sacrificed trying to save her, and a fierce, unshakable relief that the long shadow hanging over her own life for 2 months had finally, truly, been dragged into the light. "It's over," she whispered, half to herself, half to the man still holding her steady against the aftermath of everything they'd survived. Tisu pressed a kiss against her hair, gentle and reverent, the violence of moments earlier already giving way to something achingly tender. "Almost," he murmured. "There's still Hyun-woo himself, but tonight, we've cut off his hands. He has no informant left inside these walls, no strike team, no leverage to hold over either of us ever again." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, something raw and hopeful moving across his face that Victoria had never seen from him before, not once in the 2 months since a flatline had first bound their lives together. "Tonight, for the first time since the night I died on your table, I believe we might actually get to survive this together." Victoria wanted so badly to believe him. She let herself, for one full, unguarded moment, standing in the ruin of a garage where a traitor had nearly cost her everything, and a dangerous man had risked his own life instead to keep his word. But even as relief washed warm through her chest, even as Diho's men led Master Choi away in restraints, and the storm outside finally began to ease into a gentler rain, one small, cold thread of unease refused to fully unravel in the back of Victoria's mind. Because Master Choi, sobbing brokenly as they hauled him toward the stairs, turned back one final time with wild, desperate eyes, and said the one thing none of them had been prepared to hear. "Hyun-woo already knows," he choked out. "He knows Kim Tae-soo is alive because of her. He's known for weeks. Tonight was never his real plan. It was only the beginning of it." Hyun-woo already knew, and 3 weeks later, sitting in a courtroom with Tae-soo's hand wrapped tight around hers, Victoria finally understood exactly what the beginning of it had meant. Master Choi's confession, once he understood the full weight of the evidence stacked against him, had opened doors none of them expected. Not just the burner phone Diho's men recovered that night in the garage. A full paper trail, months deep, connecting Hyun-woo directly to loan sharking operations, extortion, and the ordered assault on a woman named So-yeon whose husband had risked everything to warn Victoria in the first place. Combined with the financial records Tisu's own people had spent years quietly compiling, it was enough. More than enough. Hyun-woo hadn't needed a raid on the ICU to finish this war after all. He'd needed only for one frightened, desperate father to finally tell the truth, and for one stubborn nurse to refuse to stop asking questions until she found it. Baek Hyun-woo was arrested 11 days after the hospital siege, in the same glass-walled office where he'd once studied a photograph of Victoria and Tisu under a reading lamp, and decided her life was a weapon worth aiming. He did not go quietly, but he went, and Seoul's underworld shifted permanently in the weeks that followed, the way a body shifts once a long infection has finally, fully, been cut away. Victoria thought the fear would take longer to fade. It didn't. It simply loosened, day by day, the way a held breath finally releases once the danger has actually passed rather than merely paused. She went back to her small clinic. Grace hugged her so hard on her first morning back that Victoria laughed for what felt like the first time in months, real and unguarded, and thought, not for the first time, that some ordinary, healing kindness like this was exactly what she'd left home searching for in the first place. She hadn't expected to find it wrapped around a war she never asked to fight, but there it was anyway. Tisu changed too, in the months that followed, in ways that surprised even the men who'd served him for years. He began meeting with lawyers instead of lieutenants, sold off warehouses that had once moved product across 3 countries and replaced them, one by one, with logistics companies that moved medical supplies instead, legitimate contracts, government-registered, the kind of business that put his old world's tactical precision to work saving lives rather than ending them. Di-ho, who'd spent years worrying his boss's growing attachment to a foreign nurse would be the syndicate's undoing, found himself instead running security for an international medical freight company, a job he approached, Victoria noticed with quiet amusement, with exactly the same fierce loyalty he'd once brought to far more dangerous work. "You did this," Tisu told her one evening. Nearly a year after the night her hands had first found his silent chest, the two of them standing on the balcony of an apartment that finally, truly felt like home. Every single change. "I didn't build a legitimate life because the law finally caught up to me, Victoria. I built it because I watched you save lives without asking anything in return, and I wanted, for the first time in 20 years, to be a man worth standing beside instead of a man you had to be protected from." He proposed that same night, no elaborate spectacle, no crowd of witnesses, just the two of them on that balcony overlooking a city that had once tried so hard to destroy them both, a small velvet box holding a ring that had belonged, he told her quietly, to the mother he'd lost far too young. Victoria cried before he'd even finished asking. She said yes before he'd fully gotten the question out, laughing through her tears at her own impatience, and Tisu laughed too. A full, unguarded sound she'd rarely heard from him, the sound of a man finally, completely at peace. They were married the following spring, in a small ceremony overlooking the sea, far from the glass towers and shadowed alleys that had once defined both their lives. So-yeon was there, healed and steady beside a husband finally free of the debts that had once nearly cost her life, her young daughter serving as flower girl with a seriousness that made the entire wedding party laugh. Grace flew in from Seoul with 3 of Victoria's clinic co-workers, and Di-ho stood at Tisu's side not as a lieutenant, but as a genuine friend, his usually unreadable face wet with tears he didn't bother hiding when Victoria walked down the aisle. Victoria's own mother made the trip too, flying halfway across the world to watch her daughter marry a man whose past she'd needed several long conversations to fully understand, and whose present, steady, devoted, utterly transformed by love, had won her over completely by the second day of her visit. She held Victoria's face in both hands before the ceremony began, the same way she had when Victoria was a girl heading off into a world her mother couldn't always protect her from, and told her, simply, "Baby, I raised you to run toward the people who need saving. Looks like it finally led you somewhere good." 2 years passed the way good years do, quickly, gratefully, full of small, ordinary joys that felt, to a woman who had once counted black cars outside her apartment, like the deepest kind of miracle. Tisu's logistics company grew into one of the region's most respected medical freight networks, delivering emergency supplies to disaster zones and underfunded clinics across Southeast Asia. Victoria, restless as ever with the same stubborn drive that had once put her hands on a dying stranger's chest, spent those 2 years building something of her own. A mobile emergency response unit, fully staffed and equipped, designed to reach the parts of Seoul that ambulances too often reached too late. They launched it on a bright spring morning, a small fleet of specially outfitted vans bearing a name Victoria had chosen herself, Second Chance, parked outside the very trauma center where a flatline had once changed both their lives forever. Dr. Yoon was there, older now, proud in a way he'd never quite managed to hide. Grace cried through the entire ribbon cutting. Even Kwon Di-ho, standing near the back in a suit that still somehow made him look ready for a fight, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile. Victoria stood at the podium that morning with a swell of pride she hadn't quite prepared herself for, looking out at a crowd of nurses and doctors and former patients whose lives this new initiative would touch in ways none of them could fully measure yet, and felt, tucked against her side, the small, insistent kick of the daughter she was carrying, due to arrive before the summer's end. She was born on a rainy Tuesday evening in August, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, in the very same trauma center where her parents' story had begun. Tisu held her first, tears streaming freely down a face that had once been trained never to show weakness in front of anyone. His large, scarred hands that had once held weapons, had once fought and bled and buried grief in violence, now cradling a newborn with a tenderness so complete it undid Victoria all over again, watching from the hospital bed with her own eyes blurred by exhausted, overwhelming joy. "She has your eyes," Tisu whispered, voice thick, as their daughter's small fist curled instinctively around his finger. "She has your stubbornness," Victoria said, laughing through her own tears, remembering the fierce, insistent kicks that had kept her up more nights than she could count. "God help us both." They named her Grace, after the woman who'd stood by Victoria's side through every dark month of that first terrifying year, and after the very concept itself, the thing that had carried both of them through more violence and fear than either had ever expected to survive. Little Grace Kim arrived into a world her parents had fought fiercely, sometimes desperately, to make safe for her. A legitimate world, built from love and hard-won redemption rather than fear and blood debt. Exactly the kind of life Tisu had once believed impossible for a man like him to ever deserve. Victoria thought often, in the quiet months that followed, about the woman she'd been the night she climbed onto that gurney, exhausted, alone, chasing a peaceful life 8,000 miles from everyone who'd ever loved her, with no idea that a dying stranger's second chance would eventually become the foundation of her own. She thought about 9 desperate minutes of compressions, about black cars and encrypted phones, about a hospital plunged into darkness, and a garage where a gun had nearly ended everything before it truly began. She thought about all of it, and found, to her quiet surprise, that she wouldn't trade a single frightening moment of it. Because every piece of that terrifying road had led her here, to this small, warm apartment, to a husband who had rebuilt his entire life around the woman who refused to let him die, to a daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms with absolutely no knowledge yet of just how hard-won her safe, ordinary, beautiful life had truly been. She saved the boss, and in doing so, saved an entire city. That was how the story was still told, in certain corners of Seoul, years later, the American nurse who refused to accept a flatline, and the dangerous man who tore his entire empire down and built something better in its place, all because a stranger's stubborn heart wouldn't let his stop beating. Victoria never much cared for the legend of it. She only ever cared about the truth underneath, that love, real love, the kind that survives storms and gunfire and every dark thing this world throws at it, is always worth fighting 9 impossible minutes for. Thank you so much for staying with Victoria and Tisu all the way to this final chapter. This story has meant so much to bring to you, and if it moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, please share this video with someone who needs a little hope today, a mother, a sister, a friend who could use a reminder that even the darkest beginnings can lead somewhere beautiful. And if you find yourself wanting more stories exactly like this one, stories that break your heart in one hand and heal it in the other, I've got something special waiting for you. 2 full, unforgettable novels, ready for you the moment you want them, complete with a free audiobook and every future release included. If you're watching on your TV tonight, grab your phone and scan the QR code right there on your screen. If you're already on your phone, the link is waiting for you in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. Go get lost in a story tonight. You've more than earned it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.